There was no crime here.
They have conspired to deny me my California constitutional right to a preliminary hearing.
This lady died in Phil's home. There was no crime.
That my fingerprints were not on the gun, and that the gun the deceased used to kill herself was not owned by me nor registered to me.
And we're anxious to make certain, and our mission is to make certain that we win this case here in this building and in the court of public opinion.
I urge a fellow artist, Governor Schwarzenegger, to step in and grant me my California constitutional right, stop this miscarriage of justice and obstruction of justice.
Welcome back to the second part of our two-part series detailing the madness and genius of Phil Spector. We're very grateful for the response we got for the first episode, so on to the conclusion.
I myself have a tremendous yearning to be respected, a yearning to be accepted. I see this in the teenagers, yearning to do things, to be someone, to be important, and to be recognized. It's most difficult to say exactly why anyone would respond to this music, but basically it is an emotional music for an emotional generation.
In case you're jumping in on this episode, Part 1 talked about the influence that Phil Spector had in the music business. Originally focusing primarily as a songwriter and guitar player, then transitioning into a producer. He developed a production technique known as the wall of sound. This is a dense and layered production style specifically suited to make music stand out on the popular AM radio at the time. He was the primary driver of groups such as the Ronettes and the Crystals. He influenced artists from the Beach Boys to the Beatles. He was instrumental in writing and producing hits such as You've Lost That Lovin' Feeling for the Righteous Brothers and River Deep Mountain High for Ike and Tina Turner. But there was also the madness that began to emerge. Spector was a controlling man, not just in the studio crafting records, but also with the women in his life and later musicians that he would work with. He was jealous, he was controlling, and he was paranoid, carrying guns everywhere he went, despite also bringing personal bodyguards with him everywhere he went.
How could they hate somebody whose records are filled with so much love, and not only love, so much honesty, and so much pure fucking talent?
In the previous episode, we heard about his complete control over Ronnie Spector, his second wife and lead singer for the Ronettes, and how she had to escape his compound barefoot like a prison break. In the second part of the series, we'll detail Spector's work with Leonard Cohen, the Beatles, and the Ramones, all of which involved firearms. We'll explore his deeper descent into paranoia and madness, where he became a recluse for almost 2 decades until the night that Lana Clarkson took her last breath in front of Phil Spector and his 2 subsequent trials for her murder. I'm Lorne, and on Everything is Grey, we delve into the societal impact of artists and individuals who have profoundly influenced our lives. We strive to reconcile their contributions with their actions and beliefs. In 1970, Phil Spector was entering a new era of music. The pop music of the 60s was giving way to more organic rock bands like the Rolling Stones, Creedence Clearwater Revival, and Jimi Hendrix. Phil began to pivot his music career to work with artists that were influenced by his production techniques. In 1969, the Beatles began working on what would be their last album that they would put out while still a band, Let It Be. The Let It Be album was the record that followed the contentious recording sessions of the White Album. During the recording of the White Album, the cracks began to form in the Beatles. Personal issues and egos emerged, which made the recording of that double album take a different path than their previous recordings. It was the recording session where the constant presence of Yoko Ono increased tensions amongst the rest of the Beatles. The essential communication between Lennon and McCartney was disrupted, which made for a difficult production, particularly for a double album. The following year, the Beatles began production on Let It Be. The original concept for this record was to title it Get Back, primarily to focus on getting back to their roots as a rock and roll band, eliminating the more orchestral and experimental production techniques from their previous records. The recording of Let It Be was disastrous in most ways. The year prior, Lennon and Yoko Ono had been arrested while staying in Ringo Starr's London flat on possession of cannabis. This, coupled with Yoko Ono's miscarriage, caused Lennon to sink further into an addiction to heroin. His addiction further complicated the album, in that Lennon was unable to contribute as many songs as Paul McCartney did, essentially only solely writing 2 of them, Across the Universe and Dig a Pony, while McCartney had written 4 of them himself. The rest were joint compositions, with the exception of Maggie May, which was a traditional song that the Beatles had arranged themselves. You can hear their longtime producer, George Martin, talking about the problematic production of the album here.
The feeling between the boys wasn't good. There were fights, there were rows. Yoko was always there. It was an unhappy record. I was losing control. My voice wasn't heard, and I got very dispirited indeed. John's demands that we should make this an honest album. None of your production rubbish, he would say. I don't want any editing. I want everything to be live. All we do is record it, and you tell me when it's right. And it got very tedious because it wasn't right. I would say, that was 19, John. There was a bit of a fluff on the bass guitar. Easy to edit. No, we're not doing any editing. And we agreed that we would put it in, warts and all. Put in the mistake. Put in the count-ins. Put in the chit-chat in between takes. And make it like a private eye dropping in on the Beatles. And that was how I made the album. But then after Abbey Road was issued, Paul rang me up one day and said, do you know what's happened to Let It Be? I said, no. He said, they've taken it to America and they've given it to Phil Spector. And he's been doing all the things that John said he wouldn't do. And they put heavenly choirs and all sorts of soupy strings on it. On my songs. He was furious. So was I. And that was how Let It Be evolved eventually. And then the final snub was that EMI said, well, we wouldn't have my name, on the album. Because Phil Spector had now produced it. And I said, well, look, let's have a compromise. Why don't you say, produced by George Martin, overproduced by Phil Spector?
The production of this album was so problematic that the Beatles actually wrote and recorded their Abbey Road record after the Let It Be sessions, and then released Abbey Road before Let It Be was completed by Phil Spector. Arguments were so bad during the rehearsals at Twickenham Studios that George Harrison quit the band and flew to LA. The band agreed to reunite with Harrison to finish the album at Apple Studios. Their longtime producer, George Martin, then worked with the band along with engineer Glenn Johns, who had previously worked with the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, and the Who. The recording of Let It Be, or Get Back, as that was still its working title at the time, culminated in the famous rooftop concert, which would mark the last live performance that the Beatles ever played. The end result of these recording sessions was a pile of recorded tapes, with which the Beatles didn't know what to do with. McCartney and Lennon then had engineer Glenn Johns take the tracks and mix them the way he saw fit. After working on the Get Back album, the Beatles ultimately rejected Glenn Johns' version of the record. A few months later, the Beatles asked Glenn Johns again to mix and compile the album to match the songs that were included on the unreleased Get Back film that was in production. Once again, Glenn Johns' efforts were rejected by the Beatles. This is when Phil Spector was brought in. George Harrison and John Lennon were big fans of the production work that Spector had innovated, and Spector had produced the John Lennon solo single Instant Karma earlier that year, as well as Harrison's solo album All Things Must Pass, which contained the hit song My Sweet Lord. Harrison and Lennon gave Spector the tapes from the Let It Be sessions and asked him to try and complete the album. Harrison and Lennon gave Spector the tapes from the Let It Be session and asked him to try and complete the album. He was essentially hired to salvage what was recorded and create an album that could be released. Phil Spector then turned what was originally intended to be a more stripped-down record into a heavily orchestrated record. This included hiring a 50-piece orchestra and a 14-piece choir to perform on top of several of the songs. There are arguments to be made whether or not these changes improved the material that the Beatles had previously recorded. There was no arguing that Paul McCartney hated these changes, as well as the original producer George Martin. Across the Universe was turned into a dreamier version, which thematically fit the song. However, McCartney particularly objected to Spector's treatment of his song, The Long and Winding Road. This was a song that had a stripped-down sound, with mostly McCartney singing at the piano with the rest of the band coming in complimenting the piece, including a sketchy bass performance from John Lennon. Spector added the most grandiose orchestration on top of this straightforward piano ballad. In all fairness, initially McCartney gave his approval of Phil Spector's version of the album. After it was completed, Spector sent an acetate of the record to each band member for approval. Acetates were basically one-off records that could be recorded in the studio without the need of a pressing plant. Basically, this is how these recordings were shared with artists prior to the invention of the cassette. In Phil Spector's defense, which is the only time I'll be defending him on this podcast, he included a note with the acetate that read, "If there's anything you'd like done to the album, let me know, and I'll be glad to help. If you wish, please call me about anything regarding the album tonight." All four of the Beatles had approved the album as is. It was only just prior to the album's release that McCartney began to speak out publicly. He demanded changes to an album that had already been approved. He stated in an interview with the Evening Standard, "The album was finished a year ago, but a few months ago, American record producer Phil Spector was called in by John Lennon to tidy up some of the tracks. But a few weeks ago, I was sent a remixed version of my song, The Long and Winding Road, with harps, horns, an orchestra, and women's choir added. No one had asked me what I thought. I couldn't believe it. I would never have female voices on a Beatles record. Phil Spector's work on Let It Be has been fodder for Beatles aficionados over the years. Since the production changed hands so many times before its release, George Martin is quoted as saying, "I produced the original, and what you should do is have a credit saying, produced by George Martin, overproduced by Phil Spector." Eventually, Paul McCartney released what he considered to be the better version of Let It Be in 2003 titled Let It Be Naked. This version stripped out the orchestration from Phil Spector and went back to what was originally envisioned. Although I prefer a song like Across the Universe with the original Spector version, songs like The Long and Winding Road are much better in the stripped down version. George Harrison, my mom's favorite Beatle, even gave his approval of Let It Be Naked before he passed away in 2001, prior to the album's release in 2003. The 70s were a time for Phil Spector when he was working with artists that were more authentic and less manufactured than the girl groups he was known for in the 1960s. The 70s artists that Spector wound up working with were George Harrison, John Lennon, Yoko Ono, Leonard Cohen, and surprisingly the Ramones. And Spector kept behaving erratically. There were more incidents with guns and bodyguards. Along with his increasingly erratic behavior were absolutely classic recordings, including John Lennon's Imagine, George Harrison's My Sweet Lord, Rock and Roll High School by the Ramones. Throughout his extensive work with George Harrison, John Lennon, and Yoko Ono's solo work in the 1970s, Phil Spector became increasingly erratic with his paranoia. While producing George Harrison's 1970 album All Things Must Pass, Phil Spector's alcoholism began to significantly increase his erratic behavior. According to George Harrison, Spector would not start work until he had consumed 18 cherry brandies. During one of the tracking sessions, Spector wound up falling over and breaking his arm. From that time on, Spector withdrew from his hands-on production of the album due to medical reasons. Although, he would still send feedback and suggestions for the overdubbing and mixing sessions via letters he would send to Harrison. Another prominent recording project that demonstrated Spector's increased paranoia and gunplay was during the recording sessions for John Lennon's 1975 solo album, Rock and Roll. This was a recording session where Lennon gave Spector full control, rather than function as a co-producer. Spector showed the same control and paranoia with Lennon that he did previously with Ronnie Spector. The recording sessions began in October 1973 with Phil Spector at the helm, but his alcoholism and paranoia had a negative impact on the record and the recording sessions. One day he showed up to the sessions in a full surgeon's outfit. While dressed in his surgeon's gown, Phil Spector fired a gun into the ceiling, supposedly as a prank. Lennon responded to the incident by telling Spector, "Phil, if you're gonna kill me, but don't fuck with my ears, I need 'em." There's another story where Spector would chase Lennon through the studio hallways with a gun drawn, shouting insults at the former Beatle. Part of his paranoid behavior entailed Spector taking the master tapes home with him every night, unbeknownst to Lennon. While this may not typically be detrimental to the recording session, it is when Spector decided to stop showing up for several months. Of course, this ground the progress of the record to a halt. You can hear John Lennon summarize the recording of Rock and Roll here.
So I thought, I know, who shall I use? The great Phil Spector, you know. It took me 3 weeks to talk him into being the producer. I said, look, I'm Ronnie on this one, all right? I just want to sing. I don't want to know nothing about nothing. So we started the sessions, and they went well, and then they gradually collapsed into mania, is one way of putting it. And next minute, I didn't have the tapes, and Phil had a car accident. That's all I heard. I waited 8 months in LA, waiting for him to recover. He's a mysterious man. His woodwork to perform, my dear. Phil works in such mysterious ways. His woodwork to perform. He's a great artist, but like all artists, it's, you know.
It was just a few months after this time that Phil Spector was in a very serious car accident. In March of 1974, Spector was thrown through the windshield of his car. The accident was so bad that he was almost declared dead at the scene. The only thing that saved him from death was the attending police officer was able to detect a faint pulse. Spector was rushed to the UCLA Medical Center. He required hours of surgery and had 300 stitches to his face and 400 stitches to the back of his head. This is likely the reason that Spector wore a variety of wigs in his later life, including the outlandish wigs he'd wear during his trial for the murder of Lana Clarkson. After his accident, Spector became more of a recluse, only emerging to work on a handful of albums for the remainder of his life. One of the more notable records that Spector produced was Leonard Cohen's Death of a Ladies' Man in the summer of 1977. The approach to Death of a Ladies' Man was a significant departure from Leonard Cohen's earlier work. You can hear Leonard Cohen talk about working with Spector in this 1985 interview.
Well, I thought my instincts were right in working with Phil Spector. He's a writer and a musician and a musical mind that I have enormous admiration for, and I listened to his music all my life. And he came to a concert of mine that I gave in Los Angeles, and we went back to his house, and as the evening wore on, we found ourselves at the piano, and we started to write some songs together. And we wrote for the next couple of months together. And I think we wrote some good songs. In the studio, he took over completely, and there were a lot of armed guards around. And he mixed the tapes without me. He confiscated them under armed guard. So I had, either the option of hiring my own private army and fighting it out with him in the street, or letting him take the tapes. So I had some reservations about the mixes, but I feel a lot more tender about the album now. I think it's a good album.
Is Phil Spector as crazy as people say he is?
Yes, he's a lot crazier than people say he is. But he's also a very sweet man. And when you meet him one-to-one, he's incredibly hospitable, incredibly generous. But when he has an audience, he becomes a performer of a kind of Medici magnitude. He becomes a medieval tyrant. Then it gets a little tricky. And there's also a lot of guns around and bullets falling out of 45s, and it does get a little tricky.
What isn't mentioned in that interview is that during the recording sessions, Spector took a loaded pistol, cocked it, and placed it against Leonard Cohen's neck. He quietly told Cohen, "I love you." Cohen responded with, "I hope you love me, Phil." And just like Spector did with the John Lennon rock and roll record, he just disappeared with the master tapes. Cohen wasn't happy with the vocals that were there and were hoping to redo them, but essentially the recording sessions were abandoned and Spector wound up mixing the album himself. Cohen always gave mixed responses on his feelings for Death of a Ladies Man over the years. In 1985, he stated, "People were skidding around on bullets. Guns were finding their way into hamburgers. Guns were all over the place. It wasn't safe. It was mayhem. But it was part of the times. It was rather drug-driven. But I like Phil, and the instinct was right. I'd do it again." The end result was a washy departure from Cohen's previous records, although the album itself has plenty of fans. The next major album produced by Phil Spector was End of the Century by the Ramones. Certainly a departure from his previous artists. Spector had initially offered to help the Ramones with their production of their 1977 album Rocket to Russia, but the band refused. The Ramones were never a huge selling band, so their record production budgets were low. However, this was 1977, the pinnacle of the time in the music industry, where punk rock was becoming more mainstream with bands like the Sex Pistols and The Clash, both of which were largely influenced by the Ramones. In 1979, the Ramones ultimately hired Spector to produce their album End of the Century. This created a conflict in their respective working styles. The Ramones were used to recording very quickly. Spector's style of recording was meticulous, time-consuming, and expensive. The end result was a record that ultimately cost $200,000 in 1979, or about $880,000 in today's currency. You can hear the Ramones talk about working with Spector here.
We wanted to work with Phil because the guy is a legend, and we thought it'd be a very good idea to work with a legend, and you never know when it'd be his last project. Plus, we didn't really know how difficult it is to work with the guy before we stepped into it. We found out.
Like when before I wanted to work with him 100%, and I was gung-ho for the project, but he came off differently. He seemed more positive and more able. And when I got into the studio, I found him to be like a helpless little boy or something, like a very helpless person. He didn't know what to do. And that just stifles creativity when you just hang around in agony and frustration and stomp your foot and say, oh, what are we going to do? And all. That doesn't bring out anything in anybody.
I guess faced with the project, he was very enthused, and then when she gets to that all of a sudden now it's the time, I guess then he must get a bit nervous about that all of a sudden it's getting near the time where he has to put out a project which is going to be criticized.
He seemed like a man.
Then it becomes very hard. It gets harder and harder for him to finish the project from the time at pre-production. Well, working with Phil is very difficult because I guess he's a perfectionist, so he likes to spend a lot of time redoing things and re-listening, and it's very time-consuming. It becomes very hard rock and roll's got to be spontaneous and done a little faster.
You know, I think we can adequately go into a studio and do it and not just be frustrated. And Phil seemed to be frustrated with us.
I think he's frustrated himself, really.
He wasn't the most friendly guy I've ever met. He tried to be friends, but then he had a guns on him, and he wouldn't let me out of his house for a couple days, and and I never met anyone like him, and I hope No,
he's just too difficult to work with, and it's too costly and time-consuming. And in the 1980s, the opening chord to a song of Rock and Roll High School, he spent 12 hours sitting there listening to that same chord over and over again. I mean, it's just not worth it. And nobody else could hear the difference. The chord came out sounding okay, but 12 hours worth ain't really worth it, You just go crazy. You would be as crazy as him if we worked with him. Times have changed, and most producers from the mid-'60s haven't really grown with the changes. They're not able to do what producers now can do. There's a new modern sound, and he doesn't have it. His time's passed.
He seemed like a man walking his last mile doing our record, that grim.
In Dee Dee Ramone's autobiography, he states, "He leveled his gun at my heart and then motioned for me and the rest of the band to get back in the piano room. He only holstered his pistol when he felt secure that his bodyguards could take over. Then he sat down on his black concert piano and made us listen to him play and sing 'Baby I Love You' until well after 4:30 in the morning." In all fairness, here's what Marky Ramone had to say about working with Phil Spector.
Well, we knew that Phil was used to the studio working there, and that he had his hands on creating a certain sound. So we were very optimistic and privileged to have worked with Phil Spector in that studio because they went together. He trusted the studio to get a certain sound, which it did, and he integrated that with the Ramones sound. So, which was a wall of sound, and then you have Phil Spector's wall of sound when he did the overdubs after we left the studio. We were very happy to know that we were going to be in that famous studio.
And here Marky Ramone further talks about the allegations of Spector pulling a gun on the Ramones.
I don't want to bust anyone's bubble, but Phil never pointed a gun at us in the studio. That's bullshit. Sorry, but he didn't. But people need to sell books, so they'll put that in there. He might have pulled a gun at a different occasion when they met him, when they were probably feeling him out about producing End of the Century. But in the studio, he never pulled a gun. And I think in one of the documentaries, Johnny Ramone goes, "Phil, what are you going to do, shoot me?" Yeah. He wasn't pointing a gun at him. He knew he had guns on him. Big difference.
Yeah, so that legendary story.
Yeah, it's bullshit.
Holding you hostage.
Yeah, bullshit. No hostage. There were no guns. And
the end result of the recording of End of the Century was an album that replaced much of the edgy and cutting guitars with full horn sections. A ton of washy reverb was added, which is characteristic of Spector's record production. Certainly a much debated record amongst fans of the Ramones. You can hear the wash on the overproduced but fantastic song, Do You Remember Rock and Roll Radio? Listening to a more straightforward punk song like Rock and Roll High School, there are massive layers of vocals and an abundance of reverberation. These are classic Ramones songs, but their production is massively different from their previous and subsequent albums. The only real album that Spector produced in the 80s was Yoko Ono's Season of Glass, which came out shortly after the assassination of John Lennon. Speaking of the assassination of John Lennon, this interview with Phil Spector regarding the assassination illustrates the paranoia that Spector was sinking into.
Do you think John Lennon was assassinated?
I don't know. If he, as I said earlier, if he wasn't, they did a hell of a job if they did. I mean, they got rid of so many great ones, and if they didn't do it purposely, they might as well have. Because, if Mark Chapman was a dupe, like Lee Harvey Oswald was, then, he was the perfect dupe. They couldn't have picked a crazier guy. He's perfect for the role. He was about to start to talk, John. He was about to start to become active. It's the perfect time to get rid of him. It's certainly a probability.
For the remainder of the 80s, Spector made limited public appearances. His first major appearance was to induct Ike and Tina Turner into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. If you listen to a little bit of it here, you'll find that he was charming and kind of funny. And although you'll have to take my word for it, he looks rather normal.
The first time I saw Ike and Tina Turner, I know everybody did, it was the Ike and Tina Turner review. Whatever happened to the word review? You understand? MC Hammer would be served well to use that, the MC Hammer review. Very good. And whatever happened to the names when you played an instrument like Ivory Johanna? How about Ivory Paul Schaefer?
Now you're talking.
There you go. How about Guitar Eric? Yeah. George Guitar Harrison. Yeah, it should come back.
Now, he may have been gracious when talking about Tina Turner during the induction of Ike and Tina, but years later, in 2007, which was 4 years after the death of Lana Clarkson, Spector had some choice words regarding Tina Turner that he spoke at Ike's funeral. Phil downplayed Tina Turner's talent. He spoke with regards to Tina Turner's autobiography, I, Tina. He said, "It's a badly written book that demonized and vilified Ike. Ike made Tina the jewel she was. When I went to see Ike play at the Cinegrill in the 90s, there were at least 5 Tina Turners on stage performing that night, and any one of them could have been the real Tina Turner." His contempt for the women that he had previously worked with didn't end there. For years, the Ronettes were eligible to enter the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Phil Spector was a member of their board of governors, and it is thought that Spector held up any possibility of their nomination. However, in 2007, while Spector was awaiting his first trial for the murder of Lana Clarkson, the Ronettes were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. In a written statement from jail, Spector wrote, regarding their induction, "It's like inducting Mickey Mantle's bat into the Hall of Fame, but not Mantle." Which brings us to the murder of Lana Clarkson. On the early morning of February 3rd, 2003, Spector's driver was waiting in the car outside Spector's mansion. He heard a loud bang and saw Phil emerge with a gun in his hand, stating, "I think I killed her." After years of paranoia, controlling behavior over women, and gunplay had culminated in the events that led to the death of actress Lana Clarkson. The events that transpired that evening were debated between the prosecution and the defense. The events that led up to the murder began on February 2nd, 2003. Spector had a couple of dates that night. He started the evening by taking his first date to the Grill on Alley at 7 p.m. Afterwards, Spector and his driver took the first date back to her home. At 10 p.m., he returned to the Grill on Alley and picked up his second date for the evening, who was a waitress there. The two of them and the chauffeur went to Trader Vic's and then to Dan Tana's, an Italian restaurant. The three of them then arrived at the House of Blues after midnight. At this point, Spector had his driver take his second date home for the night while he would chat up Lana Clarkson, who was working the door of the VIP room. Clarkson was working this job to make ends meet between acting gigs. Lana Clarkson was a genuine actress. She had small roles in films like Scarface and Fast Times at Ridgemont High. She was best known as a B-movie queen, starring in Roger Corman-style movies like Barbarian Queen, where she had the lead role. She was also the lead actress in Barbarian Queen 2, although she portrayed a completely different character. As she was getting older, her roles were beginning to dry up, and Clarkson was working on pivoting to a career in stand-up comedy. While at the House of Blues, Spector ordered an $8.50 drink and a $5 bottle of water and left a $450 tip. At 3 a.m. in the morning, Spector's chauffeur drove Clarkson and Spector back to his compound in Alhambra. 2 hours later, by 5 a.m., Clarkson was dead. The chauffeur testified that Spector had emerged from the mansion after hearing a gunshot stating, "I think I killed her." He then drove the limo down the street while Phil was still in the doorway and called 911. Spector would later state that he was the one who called the police. When the authorities arrived, Spector was arrested on suspicion of murder. Regarding what happened that evening, Spector stated to Esquire magazine, "She kissed the gun. I have no idea why. I never knew her, never even saw her before that night. I have no idea who she was or what her agenda was. They have the gun. I don't know where she got the gun. She asked me for a ride home. Then she wanted to see the castle. She was loud. She was loud and drunk, even before we left the House of Blues. She grabbed a bottle of tequila from the bar to take with her. I was not drunk. I wasn't drunk at all. There is no case. She killed herself." Spector contended that Clarkson killed herself while in the foyer of his mansion, something his defense attorneys would call either suicide or accidental suicide. That day, Clarkson's body was removed by authorities for an autopsy. The autopsy revealed that Clarkson had bruising on her tongue due to blunt force trauma, which may have been due to a gun barrel forcefully shoved into her mouth. There were also significant bruises to her right arm and wrist. Clarkson was not a depressed person. She had no history of it and had no known previous suicide attempts. She was prescribed the antidepressants Elavil and Paxil, but those were prescribed by a neurologist for headaches. There was evidence that the gun had been wiped down. There was Clarkson's blood in Spector's right front pants pocket. the gun that ended the life of Clarkson was a .38 caliber Colt Cobra revolver. The ammunition found in the gun was a rare type of ammo called .38 Special plus P rounds. This is key because this ammunition was quite rare. It hadn't been manufactured for over 10 years at that time. The claim that the gun was Clarkson was diminished because that specific ammunition was found in Spector's other guns around the house. Also next to Clarkson's body was the open drawer of the bureau that contained a small holster that fit the .38 Colt Cobra. It was also made by the same manufacturer of holsters that two of other Spector's guns had. During the search of Spector's house, detectives found and seized at least 9 other handguns. Some were purchased or sold to Spector, others had an incomplete or unknown ownership history, primarily because those firearms predated some of the modern laws regarding tracking of transfer of ownership of the weapons. After Spector was booked into the jail, the detective sat him down and noted he was very intoxicated. In subsequent statements, Phil said that he was sober, while Clarkson was intoxicated. During the initial line of questions, Spector stated that he had no idea where Clarkson got the gun. He stated that she was waving the gun in the air while singing songs that Spector had written, and then put the gun to her head and pulled the trigger. He further referred to Clarkson as a piece of shit. Phil Spector went on trial on March 19, 2007, 4 years after Clarkson's death. Throughout the course of his legal journey, Spector went through 3 different attorneys. First was Robert Shapiro of the famed O.J. Simpson trial. Spector and Shapiro had a falling out over the $1 million retainer that was required. For the majority of the trial, Spector was represented by Bruce Cutler, who was famous for his successful defense of John Gotti numerous times, helping to achieve the nickname Teflon Don. Cutler left most of the way through the trial and was replaced by attorney Linda Kenny Baden, who would later become part of the legal team for the disgraced New England Patriot Aaron Hernandez. The first trial ended on September 26, 2007. The jury was split 10-2 in favor of conviction, which resulted in a mistrial.
At this time, I will find that the jury is unable to arrive at a verdict and declare a mistrial in this matter.
I voted guilty. I mean, I was one of at the very beginning, I mean, I knew from the evidence and the experts and for some reason, I thought it'd be a done deal, in and out. And it wasn't.
According to interviews with jurors, the split in the jury was due to 2 people believing that Lana Clarkson had committed suicide. Phil Spector's second trial began about a year later on October 20th, 2008. This time the verdict was different. After 19 days of deliberations, on April 19th, 2009, Spector was found guilty of murder in the second degree, as well as using a firearm in commission of a crime.
The jury in the above entitled action find the defendant, Philip Spector, guilty of the crime of second-degree murder of Lana Clarkson in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony, as charged in count 1 of the indictment.
Spector was sentenced to 15 years in prison for the second-degree murder conviction, as well as an additional 4 years for using a firearm in the commission of the crime. Over the years, the various appeals filed by Spector's attorneys were ultimately unsuccessful, and Spector was sent to the North Kern State Prison. In 2014, he was transferred and would spend the remainder of his days in the California Healthcare Facility, a prison for patients with long-term physical and mental health needs. This was due to Spector reportedly suffering partial paralysis due to a stroke, as well as difficulty speaking.
With breaking news this morning, legendary music producer and convicted killer Phil Spector has died. He died at a hospital yesterday evening at the age of 81.
On January 16th, 2021, Phil Spector passed away at the age of 81 due to complications of COVID-19. That's 41 more years than Lana Clarkson got to live. Phil Spector leaves a varied legacy. He is revered for his innovation in record production techniques with his wall of sound. He pioneered techniques that are still used today. But then there's the other side of his ego. He also had a violent legacy, which was ironic, since he helped produce one of the greatest anthems for peace ever, John Lennon's Imagine. In the end, the music world can be thankful for his contributions, but an unchecked ego, coupled with his paranoia, brought an undeserved end to the life of Lana Clarkson. Can we appreciate his work and ignore the horrendous murder that capped his turbulent career? Is it possible to listen to these songs without picturing Spector forcefully shoving a pistol in Lana Clarkson's mouth and then pulling the trigger? This is a question we all need to answer for ourselves. However, since Spector's children inherited his estate, the finances from his musical legacy go to them, and they too suffered under Spector's controlling grasp. In 2009, Clarkson's family received a sizable settlement from Spector and his insurance company. I'm Lauren with Everything is Gray. Thanks for listening. This episode was written and produced by Lauren Bregitzer. This episode is dedicated to the lovely Lana Clarkson, a life cut short all too soon.